Story 1. My aunt was dating an unemployed dude for a while. He was staying in her house rent-free. They got married and were getting ready to go on the honeymoon when the new husband tells her he's not going because he has to take care of his plants at the house. Big fight. Aunt goes on the honeymoon with her sisters instead. She comes home and tries to kick him out of her house, but he refuses to leave. She tries to get the police involved. Dude is live streaming on Facebook how he's being trapped in his own home. Police tell my aunt there is basically nothing they can do, can file for eviction after a divorce. Dude gets to live in her house with his precious plants for like 3 months until everything legally works out. Story 2. Paralegal here. There are so many crazy divorces, and divorce will bring out the absolute worst in couples. When thinking of reasons a divorce started, this one stands out to me the most. At my last firm, we did general law, which included probate. A couple did their will with our firm. We drafted everything. They were mid-70s to early 80s, married 40 years total. Divorced and remarried once. Husband wanted us to put in his will that his kids get his entire estate, but did not want us to tell his wife. He wanted to have us make a secret will and a fake will. The fake will would be signed with her present, and then he wanted us to shred it and he would come in later to sign the real will. He copied his wife on the email that had all of this information disclosed in it. 2 weeks later, he called us and said he wanted to file for divorce instead. Bonus 1. A previous client was pissed his wife was cheating on him. She wanted a non-contested divorce and wanted to use my boss specifically because she knew he was a great lawyer. He pretended to go along with her terms and contacted us literally 2 days before his wife and retained us. He said he didn't care how much money the retainer was, but wanted my boss so his wife couldn't have him as a lawyer. He called and paid first, so he won that battle. Story 3. Not a lawyer, but I have been aching to tell this story for a while. So this girl I went to school with marries this rich guy from Ohio. She moves in with him and they seem to get along well. 6 months later, she filed for divorce. Up to that point, all I've heard from her was how good it was going. Anyways, it turns out our buddy had a fetish for going off on urine. He asked her to urinate on him in the tub. At first, she agreed to it, as she thought it was a one-time thing, but he kept asking for it more and more. She tried to decline it respectfully, but he wouldn't get any of the hints. She finally used the tub being too small as a reason. Next day, she comes home with 24 construction guys and their heavy equipment tearing the bathroom walls. A week or so later, they finish up the bathroom. She comes home to a sign left on the fridge with a note to drink up. She's got some watering to do. I don't know what exactly she put down as the official reason in the paperwork, but that was definitely her biggest reason to walk out of that relationship. Oh, I forgot to add. He also wanted to bring a horse to do the deed, and at times asked her to make animal sounds while she stood on top of him. Story 4. I'm a lawyer that handles quite a few divorces, among other things, and I've seen all sorts of reasons for marriages ending. The only thing that is consistently true and relevant to this question is that it is never for just one reason, and it is never one-sided. In fact, I've started telling potential clients in our initial interview that I'm well aware that I'm going to uncover some dirt on my client in the process. Not to scare them, but to put their mind at ease that I have seen worse. The fact that you haven't been 100% an angel up to this point doesn't scare me, and I'd rather find out about it from my client beforehand than later on from their spouse at the worst possible moment. All this is just to say that when you hear about people divorcing over one stupid argument or mistake, usually that's just the straw that broke the camel's back. That said, below are some of the lighter straws I've seen. A guy who is 100% convinced that his wife, our client, is actually a lesbian in love with his sister and just using him as a cover, but he also claims she's having sex with me to pay for her legal fees, and with every male whose phone number is in her call history. A woman who's divorcing my client because he was too sad after his father died last year. My client had to break down her door to get his father's ashes a few weeks after he left the house, and she refused to let him back in or give them to him. A woman who claims my client was emotionally abusive towards her because he refused to yell at her, and sat in silence ignoring her when she screamed at him. He has this recorded, time-stamped for the dates and times she insists the incident occurred, and she's listened to them and his complete silence as she goes on tirades and insists this proves her point that he was emotionally distant and abusive. Story 5. I used to work in a general practice firm, and the guy that worked across the hall from me was a family law attorney. He was a good attorney, but every day I would hear him yelling on the phone at his clients. One day I asked him why he did it, when it was obviously stressful in a non-legal work type of way. He pointed out that there's one chapter of statutes dedicated to it, and you need to know a little civil procedure, and that's about it. It's an amazing segment of business. Not only is it not that difficult from an intellectual rigor perspective, but holy shit, those family law attorneys make serious bank willing to put up with the headaches. I would routinely hear him yelling at clients like, "Don't go over there. I'm instructing you not to go there. If you go there, I will fire you as a client, and when you go to jail, I won't take your call." For the record, this was in a fairly affluent suburb. Most of the disputes that would drive him into my office for a break would revolve around parents wanting to know their recourse for ex-hubby dropping the kids off 4 minutes later than agreed, and how the client planned to get even. I also recall one time a client had gotten his cell phone number and called him on a Saturday evening with some emergency. Spoiler, his ex had done something egregious like taking the kids to the pool without his consent. So on Monday morning, the attorney sent the client an invoice for $500 for a Saturday phone call, which probably lasted like 5 minutes. He did it so the guy would call him and say, "What's this?" And then the attorney could explain to him that this is what he charges for non-emergency weekend calls. This time he'd waive it, but if he ever did it again, he could be sure to get a bill that he'd end up paying. Story 6. Divorce lawyer in London. Had a client who indulged in some recreational drug use. His dealer lives in the same apartment building as him. Went down one day to pick up some of that sweet cocaine. When the drug dealer, female, came to the door, he could hear his wife in the background. Turns out that his wife also liked the high life and was getting her fix in with the neighborhood dealer. But it doesn't end there, because they all get on so well they start having parties and hanging out. Parties become drug-fueled parties, and hey, presto! Each week the husband and wife put their kids to bed and head downstairs to the dealer's flat for a feast of drugs and flesh. A couple of months go by, and the wife comes home and says she's leaving him to be in a full-time same relationship with the dealer. Dude is now stressed AF, but he can't score anymore from his dealer who stole his missus. TLDR, husband's drug dealer got the wife hooked on more than just drugs and stole his girl. Story 7. My 90-year-old client, the husband, and his son retained me to initiate divorce proceedings with his 88-year-old wife. They'd been married for 60 years. The wife had recently taken to beating him with his own cane because their daughter poisoned her into thinking he was hiding money from them. The battle came down to husband and son versus wife and daughter. At their first court appearance, my client showed up in an old 1950s-style pinstripe suit and fedora. He was a farmer his whole life, and this was clearly the only suit he owned. He was such a meek and lovely old gentleman. I had to pass my client on to a new lawyer midway through the proceedings because I accepted a job in a different country, but I understood the divorce was eventually granted. Story 8. I represented a actress webcam model who filed for divorce from her husband, who also did the webcam model business. He would do gay on the side because the pay was better. She was hesitant about it, but dealt with it because the pay was decent. Both sides had an agreement that it wasn't cheating as long as it was for work. One day, she came home early and found her husband in bed with 2 men. They were not filming. That was too much for her. Needless to say, the old conservative judge couldn't wrap his head around this one. Story 9. She was kidnapped in Mexico and he refused to pay ransom. Eventually, her family managed to pay and she was left on the side of the road. It is not outrageous as in petty, but outrageous as in how absurd it is. To answer commonly asked questions, I don't know how much they wanted as ransom, but it was substantial, as the conversation between her family and him was how he had it liquid, and they had to liquidate investments to get that amount. She may have told me, she may not. Something in pesos, and I didn't know the conversion rate. It was all a random number to me. This happened about 7 years ago. He wasn't with her on the trip. She was traveling with cousins and went downstairs alone to get ice cream and wait for them to get ready. I don't know all the details. She was extremely distraught talking about it, and it wasn't necessary to pry. It was clearly traumatic, and even though I had a million more questions, I left it alone. Story 10. Staff attorney for a judge. Not a divorce, but a custody modification hearing. Ex-wife wanted sole L&P custody of the kids because the ex-husband was spending all his money on a palm reader/psychic and refused to pay child support. On cross, ex-wife's attorney got him to admit that he was spending all his discretionary income on this psychic. He said he had spent over $5,000 on readings and other services there. Judges frequently chime in with questions in domestic matters. So my judge asked why he was not paying support as his divorce decree required. His explanation was, 1, the psychic could read that his children were provided for without his money, and 2, he would be able to repay the ex when he takes the children to Mexico permanently to seek great riches there, which my judge read as, my psychic told me to kidnap my kids. TLDR, deadbeat ex-husband spent all his money on a psychic rather than child support. Told the judge he intended to kidnap his children. Story 11. My husband's first marriage lasted 6 months. He found out she had been sleeping around with several of his friends, and one of those friends finally felt so guilty that he fessed up. Husband actually wanted to work it out if he could, but when he tried to talk to her about it, she locked him out of the house and told him she wanted a divorce. "Why did you marry me?" he finally asked her. Her response? Because he was the only one she was sleeping with who could afford her dream wedding. Yup. Married him because she wanted a wedding and chose the person who could afford it. Mind you, he wasn't wealthy by any means. He just wishes his friend had felt guilty about, say, 6 months sooner. Story 12. My great-great-grandparents had an interesting case. He was abusive, like pimp her out and then beat her for infidelity levels of abuse. This was the 1910s though, and in our state, you couldn't initiate a divorce for cruelty. In fact, the only possible grounds for divorce was infidelity. A few times, she tried just leaving him anyway. Once, he came home from work and she, plus all 8 of their kids, were just gone. But he always found them, and since they were still married, he had every right to grab the kids and go back home with them. Finally, she moved out and went to live with another man. She flaunted the new guy around town until her no-good husband got embarrassed enough to sue her for divorce on the grounds of infidelity. Although she couldn't read or write, she put her ex on those papers the minute he served her. It was a major local scandal, very Catholic community, divorce was rare, but she got what she needed to be safe. Story 13. My client was the outrageous one, so my heart went out to his poor wife. He had OCD, which manifested primarily financially, so he made their lives a penny-pinching hell. Examples. He was obsessed with avoiding unnecessary driving, wear and tear on the car, gas expenses, etc. So he cut the whole family's hair at home and never let them eat at a restaurant or go to the movies. Weirdest of all, he kept one toilet paper roll on him at all times, and you had to get 1 square from him before you could go to the bathroom. He never gave more than 1 square. Wife finally got fed up and left him when 1, he gave her bangs during an in-home haircut, and 2, their daughter was so traumatized by the toilet paper thing they couldn't potty train her. Also, he hated paying his divorce lawyer bill. He was also an old-fashioned mega-Catholic who considered divorce a deadly sin. He viewed my whole job as an unnecessary and sinful expense. Story 14. Not the most outrageous, but I had a client incur about 20 additional hours of billable hours because he and his wife were battling and went to trial over their Star Wars collection. This was the only issue at trial. They were able to work out custody, child support, and the house, but the Star Wars collection went to trial. The judge ended up splitting it in the most Polish way possible, basically giving each side half of what they wanted and then mixing and matching everything else and breaking up collections. When speaking about it at a conference, the judge admitted she did it because if they were going to act like children, she would treat them like children. The thing is, the value of this collection was over $100,000, so hardly kid stuff. Neither side had it in them to appeal, nor was the case law on either side given judicial discretion in property distribution. Story 15. He was frustrated by her hoarding. She was frustrated by his utter uselessness. He filed for divorce, and she was my client. Her prized possession was a room or two full of scrapbooking materials. His prized possession was a yard full of junk cars that he never worked on. They had no children and no real assets. They hated each other more than any two people I'd ever met, and the only terms they would agree to were these. He gets the scrapbooking stuff, and she gets the cars. My client also took the house, as he had no income and didn't want it anyway. It was the shortest divorce decree I have ever drafted. I intentionally squeezed it onto one page, and the judge and I had a good laugh over it. Once the decree was signed and filed, she hauled off all the scrapbooking stuff to the yard, and he removed it to the dump. She then called a junk shop I referred her to, and all of his cars removed from the yard. Story 16. He got drunk at the wedding. She didn't like it, and decided to divorce him right after the honeymoon, which she went to without him. Moreover, this was all an elaborate scheme of divorce robbery, because the guy was loaded, and so was his entire family. They were loaded because they were a family of excellent lawyers, and he was a third-gen lawyer with all smarts and experience of his predecessors combined. Let's just say it did not go well for her. Story 17. My father's best friend divorced his wife over her cooking. Apparently, every day he would come home to amazing cooked meals. Here, she couldn't cook at all and was ordering food from different restaurants. She even went as far as dirtying pots and pans to make it look like she cooked all day. She got away with this for almost a year before he caught on. This was back in the day before you could check your bank statements online. And since she did all the billing, he had no idea how much money was missing that she was spending on takeout. Story 18. I'm not a divorce lawyer, but the parents of one of my high school friends had a pretty ridiculous reason. His dad was using the stove to make Jell-O. His mom said Jell-O was too fattening and tried to grab the pan out of his hand to dump it down the sink. He pulled the pan back while she was trying to snatch it, and she called the act of refusing to throw out the Jell-O spousal abuse. He packed his bag and left that night, moved to a town 1,500 miles away, where he knew literally no one, just to get away from her. They had been married for over 20 years, and I think that was just the last straw. As with any of these cases, though, there's probably more going on behind the scenes that no one outside the marriage ever knows about. Story 19. Divorced guy here. I divorced my ex-wife because she decided to be a super Christian that spent hours each day lying on the floor speaking in tongues. Also, she would have random conversations with former deceased relatives while doing mundane daily activities. The final straw was when I came home from work and my 2-year-old daughter was in the fireplace eating ashes 2 feet away from her while she laid on the ground chanting and speaking in her made-up language. Story 20. Not a divorce lawyer, but used to practice criminal defense work, once had a heavily pregnant client that attacked her husband, of less than a year, with an iron. Said client was now sitting in a police cell, sobbing, and insisting that her husband deserved it and she wanted a divorce. I asked what he had supposedly done, assuming he'd cheated or something similar. Turns out, she'd checked his phone and found a single site in his browsing history, from over 2 years beforehand. Not the most pleasant thing to discover, but hardly worth battering him half to death and demanding a divorce. Story 21. Not a lawyer, but still interesting. The reason why my mom divorced my stepdad was because I was being too loud. Well, I was for a year, but then stopped. This, however, was apparently enough for him to develop a complex for loud noises. I would literally simply press a button on my PC or switch a page on my book, and he would instantly wake up and throw a tantrum, waking up everyone else. My mom finally got too fed up with this situation and filed for a divorce.